The old bearing failed silently, its steel giving way without protest or warning, a small mechanical surrender against the winter's unforgiving grip. In a moment, everything changed. Against the howling backdrop of the worst blizzard in 40 years, two strangers found themselves at the intersection of redemption and regret, where second chances come disguised as endings. Some debts can never be repaid. Some promises, once broken, leave scars that span decades. In the forgotten corners of Mapleton, where factories stand empty and foreclosure notices arrive with cruel regularity, a mechanic's weathered hands still believe in fixing what others would discard. But not all broken things can be mended with wrenches and wire. Some require courage. Some demand forgiveness. When the past comes roaring back like an engine suddenly finding spark, even the most carefully maintained walls collapse. In the bitter cold of a Midwestern winter, against impossible odds, the things we build to save others might just be what saves us in the end. The snow fell in thick, angry sheets across Mapleton, Ohio, the kind of blizzard old-timers said hadn't been seen since '78. The wind howled down Main Street, whipping between buildings with a vengeance that seemed personal. Inside Reynolds' auto, Frank Reynolds stood at the garage door window, watching the world disappear into white. His calloused fingers traced the edge of the foreclosure notice that had arrived that morning. Final warning: 30 days. The letterhead of Bedford Trust Bank seemed to mock him with its crisp, corporate font. Frank folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his overall pocket, where it sat like a stone against his heart. The radio crackled with emergency alerts between Springsteen songs. All residents advised to remain indoors. Whiteout conditions expected to continue through the night. Emergency vehicles only on all county roads. Frank glanced at the small desk calendar where he'd circled today's date 10 years ago, Sarah's anniversary. His wife wouldn't have wanted him sitting alone in an empty garage on this day, no matter the weather. He reached for his heavy coat. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the howl of the wind. Frank hesitated, then picked up. "Reynolds Auto," he answered, voice rough from disuse. "Frank, thank God." It was Sheriff Tom Gaines, his old high school buddy. "We've got stranded motorists all over County Road 27. Ambulance can't get through the drifts. Your Jeep still have that winch set up." Frank glanced at the modified 1987 Jeep Wrangler in the corner bay, its oversized tires and heavy-duty winch, a testament to decades of pulling stranded vehicles from Mapleton's unforgiving winters. "Sure does. Where do you need me?" "Library corner through to the Miller Farm stretch. Got reports of someone off the road near the creek bend. Might be nothing, but on my way." Frank grabbed the emergency kit he kept prepped from November through March every year. The garage's main bay door groaned against the wind as Frank raised it just enough to back the Jeep out. The temperature had dropped to -15, the kind of cold that burned in your lungs. As the door rumbled closed behind him, Frank caught a glimpse of the framed photo on his office wall, him and Sarah on their wedding day, her smile bright against his weathered face. He nodded to her, a ritual of 20 years, and turned the Jeep toward County Road 27. Emily Blackwood knew she was in trouble the moment her wheelchair's right wheel caught in the ice. She'd stayed too late at the library, poring over engineering textbooks long after the librarian had announced early closure due to the weather. Now, the snow was falling so fast she could barely see 3 feet ahead. "Come on," she muttered, trying to rock the chair free. The specialized off-road wheels she'd modified herself, an engineering project born of necessity rather than choice, usually handled Mapleton's uneven sidewalks with ease. But no amount of clever design could overcome 8 inches of fresh powder atop sheer ice. Her phone showed no service. The storm had knocked out the nearest cell tower. At 19, Emily had learned to be more prepared than this. Growing up with a disability in a small town meant you couldn't count on accommodations. You had to make your own way. She tried again, pushing forward with all her strength. The wheel broke free suddenly, but the momentum sent her chair sliding toward the drainage ditch that ran alongside the road. Emily felt the sickening lurch as the chair tipped, then tumbled. She hit the snow-covered ground hard, the cold immediately seeping through her clothes. The chair lay several feet away, one wheel still spinning uselessly. Emily dragged herself toward it, her legs trailing behind her. The physical therapy she'd done religiously since the accident gave her exceptional upper body strength, but the snow made movement nearly impossible. Each pull forward buried her deeper in the powder. The cold began to burn, then numb her fingers. Emily knew the signs of hypothermia from her mother's nursing books. She needed shelter. Fast. The nearest house was at least half a mile away. As consciousness began to waver, headlights cut through the blinding snow, their beams catching the reflectors she'd attached to her wheelchair. Emily summoned her remaining strength and raised one arm, waving desperately as darkness crept into the edges of her vision. The Jeep's wipers fought a losing battle against the snow as Frank inched down County Road 27. His high beams barely penetrated 20 feet ahead. The world beyond a wall of white? He'd already helped two stranded drivers, a nurse trying to get to her hospital shift and an elderly man who'd risked the storm for his heart medication. As he approached the creek bend, something flashed in his headlights, a reflection where there shouldn't be one. Frank slowed, squinting through the windshield. There, half buried in a snowdrift, was what looked like a wheelchair on its side. Jesus Christ, Frank muttered, immediately scanning the area. He spotted movement in the ditch, an arm raised weakly above the snow. He threw the Jeep into park and grabbed his emergency kit, fighting against the wind as he made his way toward the figure. A young woman lay half buried in snow, her lower body at an unnatural angle to her torso. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue, but her eyes fluttered open as Frank knelt beside her. "I've got you," he shouted over the wind. "Can you tell me your name?" Emily," she managed through chattering teeth. Frank assessed the situation with military precision, falling back on training from another lifetime. Hypothermia setting in, probable inability to walk given the wheelchair, no time to wait for an ambulance. "Emily, I'm going to move you to my Jeep. It'll hurt, but we need to get you warm." "Okay." She gave a small nod. Frank slipped his arms beneath her, lifting as gently as possible. She was lighter than she looked, all lean muscle above the waist, her legs thin beneath her snow-soaked jeans. Emily stiffened at his touch but didn't protest as he carried her to the Jeep and carefully placed her in the passenger seat. The heat was blasting full force as Frank retrieved her wheelchair, collapsing it with surprising ease. He recognized quality engineering when he saw it and secured it in the back. He grabbed an emergency blanket from his kit and wrapped it around Emily, whose shivering had intensified. A good sign. He knew. The body was still fighting. "Reynolds Auto Shop is just 2 miles back," he explained, putting the Jeep in gear. "We'll get you warmed up, then call your folks." Emily managed a nod, her eyes clearer now as the heat began to revive her. "Thank you," she whispered. Most people would have driven past a wheelchair in this weather. Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Not in Mapleton," he said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. As the Jeep crawled back toward town, Emily studied her rescuer's profile. Late 60s, she guessed, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of outdoor work and hard living. His hands on the wheel were calloused and oil-stained, a mechanic's hands, but they moved with a sureness that reminded her of her father's. The thought of her father sent a familiar pang through her chest. It had been 5 years since the accident that took him and her ability to walk in one cruel moment. Before she could sink into those memories, the Jeep turned into a driveway, headlights illuminating a worn sign, "Reynolds Auto, no job too small." The heat in the garage hit Emily like a wall as Frank helped her into a worn office chair he'd rolled up to the space heater. Her fingers and face tingled painfully as circulation returned. Frank busied himself making coffee on a hot plate that had seen better days, giving her privacy to collect herself. "Black okay?" he asked, holding out a chipped mug that read, "World's Okayest Mechanic." Emily accepted it gratefully, wrapping her still trembling hands around the warmth. "Perfect. Thanks." She took a sip, the bitter liquid burning its way down her throat. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I should have left earlier." Frank waved away her apology. Storm came in faster than they predicted. Happens every year, and every year people get caught in it. He glanced at her wheelchair, which he'd brought in and propped against the wall. "Mind if I take a look at that? Noticed your right wheel hub was making a clicking sound when I loaded it." Emily's eyebrows rose in surprise. Most people didn't notice such details, especially not in a blizzard. "You've got a good ear. 30 years of listening to engines will do that." Frank moved to the wheelchair, his practiced hands already examining the wheel mechanism. "This is quality work. Custom job." "I modified it myself," Emily said, a hint of pride creeping into her voice despite her exhaustion. "The standard models can't handle Mapleton's excuse for sidewalks, especially in winter." Frank nodded appreciatively, spinning the wheel and listening to the faint but distinct click with each rotation. "Bearings going. You've compensated with this reinforcement here, but it's a temporary fix at best." His fingers traced the metal brace she'd installed. "Smart solution, though. You an engineer, first-year engineering student at Mapleton Community College?" Emily watched him examine her handiwork with an expert's eye. "Budget version of an engineer, anyway." Frank made a non-committal sound, the kind that suggested he didn't put much stock in fancy degrees. He reached for a toolbox and extracted a set of precision wrenches. "Mind if I—" Emily nodded, curious to see what he'd do. With efficient movements, Frank removed the wheel and disassembled the hub, laying out the parts in a precise order on a clean shop rag. His methodology reminded her of her own, methodical, respectful of the mechanics. "You've got ceramic bearings in here," he noted, examining one under a work light. "Good choice for the weight reduction, but they don't handle lateral stress well. That's why it's failing." Emily leaned forward, intrigued despite herself. "The manufacturer claimed they'd hold up." "Manufacturers claim a lot of things," Frank replied dryly. He reached into a drawer and extracted a different bearing, slightly larger but with a similar design. "This is an old-school hybrid. Ceramic balls but with a steel race. Heavier, but it'll handle the torque you're putting on it when you navigate those curb cuts on Cedar Street." Emily's surprise must have shown on her face, because Frank added, "I notice things. Part of the job." As he reassembled the wheel with the new bearing, Emily found herself relaxing for the first time since the storm hit. There was something calming about watching competent hands at work, a feeling she hadn't experienced since watching her father in his workshop. "Your dad teach you mechanics?" Frank asked, as if reading her thoughts. Emily stiffened slightly. "Yes, he was good with his hands. Could fix anything. He died. Car accident. 5 years ago." She gestured to her legs. "Same one that took these out of commission?" Frank's hands paused momentarily before continuing their work. "I'm sorry," he said, and unlike most people who offered those words, he didn't follow with awkward platitudes or curious questions. He finished reassembling the wheel in comfortable silence, then reattached it to the chair. "Give that a test," he suggested, rolling the chair over to her. Emily transferred herself from the office chair to her wheelchair with practiced ease, immediately noticing the difference. The wheel rotated smoothly, the clicking gone completely. She made a quick circle around the office area, testing the handling. "This is amazing. Completely fixed." Frank shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just a bearing swap. Simple enough. What do I owe you?" Emily reached for her backpack, though she knew her wallet contained exactly $23, not likely enough for a professional repair, let alone the emergency rescue. "Coffee was payment enough," Frank replied, turning away to put his tools back in precise order. "Now, let's call your folks. They must be worried sick." Emily hesitated. "It's just my mom and me, and she's working the night shift at Mapleton General. I don't want to worry her when she can't leave anyway." Frank studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Storm's not letting up anytime soon. You're welcome to wait here until it passes or morning comes." Whichever happens first. Got a cot in the back office and some frozen dinners. Not fancy, but it's warm. Emily considered her options, which were admittedly limited. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I appreciate it. Frank, he corrected. Mr. Reynolds was my father. He glanced at her repaired wheelchair. While we wait out the storm, might as well show you how to maintain that bearing properly. Knowledge never hurts. Emily found herself smiling for the first time that night. I'd like that. As Frank demonstrated proper bearing maintenance, his mind kept returning to the girl's face. There was something familiar about her features, the determined set of her jaw, the analytical way her eyes tracked his movements. It nagged at him, like an engine sound he couldn't quite diagnose. So you're at Mapleton Community? He asked, handing her a torque wrench. What kind of engineering? Mechanical, with a focus on adaptive technology. Emily adjusted the wrench with confidence, her technique solid. I want to design better mobility devices. Most wheelchairs are either cheap garbage or so expensive nobody can afford them. There's got to be a middle ground. Frank nodded. It was sound reasoning. Your mom support this career path. A shadow crossed Emily's face. She wants me to transfer to nursing school. More practical. She says, guaranteed job. Emily tightened a bolt with perhaps more force than necessary. She works so hard already. Extra shifts to cover my medical bills. I don't want to disappoint her. But you've got oil in your veins, not antiseptic, Frank finished, recognizing the conflict. His own son had faced a similar struggle, the pull between family expectations and personal calling. Exactly. Emily looked up in surprise. Most people don't get that. My son, David, wanted to be a software engineer when hardware was the family business. I didn't understand it at the time. Frank's voice took on a distant quality. Caused a rift that never quite healed. He's in California now, some tech company. We talk twice a year, Christmas and my birthday. I'm sorry, Emily said, and like Frank earlier, she didn't follow with platitudes. Frank cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. Let's check that other wheel while we're at it. Bet the left side bearing is not far behind. As they worked side by side in the warm garage, the howling storm outside faded into background noise. Frank found himself impressed by Emily's mechanical aptitude. She asked precise questions and absorbed information like a sponge, reminding him of himself at a younger age. You said your father could fix anything, Frank commented as they finished with the second wheel. What did he do for work? Military first, then mechanical contractor, Emily replied, her eyes on the task. Army Corps of Engineers, served in Desert Storm. Frank's hands stilled. A cold sensation that had nothing to do with the blizzard spread through his chest. What was his name? He asked, working to keep his voice neutral. Robert Blackwood, Emily said. Everyone called him Rob. The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. Sand and heat, the crack of gunfire, a face much like Emily's but male, grinning across a Humvee engine. Rob Blackwood, his unit mechanic in Desert Storm, his friend, the man who had pushed Frank out of the way when the IED detonated, the man whose family Frank had promised to look after, a promise buried along with his own survivor's guilt. You knew him, Emily said. It wasn't a question. She'd caught the recognition in his eyes. Frank stood abruptly, his old knees protesting. I need to check the emergency generator. Storm like this. Power could go any minute. He escaped to the back room, leaving Emily staring after him in confusion. Alone among the spare parts, Frank braced himself against a workbench, breathing heavily. Robert Blackwood's daughter. Of all the people to find stranded in a snowstorm, it had to be Rob's girl. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. Frank had deliberately avoided the Blackwood family after returning home. He told himself it was to spare them the pain of seeing the man who lived when Rob died. In truth, he couldn't face his own failure. the split-second hesitation that had cost Rob his life. And now, here was Emily, brilliant, determined, so much like her father, sitting in his garage with no idea who Frank really was. No idea that the man who had just fixed her wheelchair was the reason she'd grown up without a father. The guilt that Frank had kept at bay for years crashed over him anew. He should tell her the truth. She deserved that much. But what good would it do now? Would it help her to know her father had died saving a man who had never found the courage to face his family? By the time Frank returned to the main garage, he'd made his decision. He wouldn't tell Emily, not tonight, maybe not ever. Instead, he would do what he should have done 5 years ago, help Robert Blackwood's daughter however he could. It was the least he owed his friend. Julia Blackwood's face was ashen when she burst through the garage door the next morning, still wearing her nurse's scrubs beneath her winter coat. "Emily!" she cried, rushing to embrace her daughter, who was drinking coffee with Frank at his small break room table. "Why didn't you call me? I've been frantic since I got home and found you gone." "Mom, I'm fine," Emily said, returning the hug but looking embarrassed. "My phone died, and I didn't want to worry you during your shift. Frank rescued me when my chair got stuck in the snow. He even fixed the bearing that's been giving me trouble." Julia turned to Frank, really seeing him for the first time. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. If anything had happened to her, "Just did what anyone would do," Frank replied uncomfortably. He extended his hand. "Frank Reynolds." Julia shook it, then froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Reynolds. From Reynolds Auto. You served with my husband." Frank's heart sank. Of course, Julia would remember the names of Rob's unit members. "Yes, ma'am. Same unit in Desert Storm." Emily's eyes widened. "Wait, you knew my dad and didn't say anything last night?" "It didn't seem the right time," Frank said lamely, feeling cornered. Julia's expression had turned cool, her initial gratitude tempered by suspicion. "Well, we won't take up any more of your time. Mr. Reynolds, Emily, let's go." "Mom, Frank spent hours fixing my chair. I was going to help organize his tool cabinet as a thank you." Emily looked between her mother and Frank, sensing the sudden tension. "Another time, perhaps," Julia said firmly. "I'm sure Mr. Reynolds has work to do." Frank recognized dismissal when he heard it. Whatever Julia Blackwood knew or suspected about him, she clearly didn't want her daughter spending more time in his company. "The chair should hold up well now," he told Emily, trying to keep his tone professional. "But if you have any trouble with it, you're welcome to come back." "Thank you," Emily said, her voice sincere despite her confusion at the adult's behavior. "For everything." As they left, Frank caught Julia's backward glance, not angry, exactly, but guarded, protective. She hadn't told Emily the full story, he realized, about how her father died, about Frank's role in it. That knowledge should have brought relief. Instead, it left a hollow feeling in his chest as he turned back to an empty garage, the foreclosure notice still heavy in his pocket. 3 days later, Frank was elbow-deep in Mrs. Hutchinson's ancient Buick when he heard the distinctive sound of wheelchair wheels on concrete. He looked up to see Emily rolling into the garage, a determined expression on her face. "Your mom know you're here?" he asked, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm 19, not 9, Emily replied, though her slight defensive tone suggested the answer was no. "Besides, I'm here on business." She reached into her backpack and produced a folded paper. "Your invoice for the bearing replacement and roadside assistance?" Frank raised an eyebrow as she handed him the paper. He unfolded it to find not a payment demand, but a neatly drawn schematic of a modified wheel hub design. "It's a hybrid ceramic steel bearing with a reinforced housing," Emily explained, watching his face. "Based on what you showed me during the storm, the current design puts too much stress on the bearing over time. This distributes the load more evenly." Frank studied the drawing with genuine interest. The design was innovative yet practical, a rare combination. "This is good work," he said, impressed despite himself. "Why show me?" "Because I need a mentor," Emily said bluntly. "Someone who understands both mechanical theory and practical application. The professors at MCC are all theory, no hands-on experience, and—" She hesitated. "I think you knew my father better than you let on." Frank set down the drawing carefully. "What makes you say that?" "The way you looked when I mentioned his name, and my mom's reaction when she realized who you were." Emily fixed him with a direct stare inherited from her father. "She wouldn't tell me anything, just that you served together. But I want to know about him, the real him, not just the sanitized stories Mom thinks are appropriate. And I want to learn from someone who thinks like he did." The request hit every one of Frank's raw nerves. His guilt over Rob, his estrangement from his own son, his reluctance to form new attachments. The smart move would be to politely refuse. Instead, he found himself asking, "What exactly are you proposing?" "An apprenticeship of sorts," Emily said, the words coming quickly as if she'd rehearsed them. "I help around the shop after classes, learn practical mechanics. In exchange, you mentor me on my adaptive technology designs and tell me about my dad. The real stuff, not the hero worship or the pity stories." Frank wiped his hands again, a habitual gesture when he needed time to think. The girl was offering him a chance to partially fulfill his promise to Rob, to help his daughter, to pass on knowledge that might serve her well. It wouldn't erase his guilt, but it might lessen it. "Your mother won't approve," he said finally. Emily's mouth set in a stubborn line. "I'll handle my mother." Frank almost smiled at that. It was exactly what Rob would have said. He glanced at the foreclosure notice tacked to his bulletin board, a constant reminder of the countdown to losing his family's legacy. Even if the garage closed in 30 days, he could still teach Emily something worthwhile in that time. "3 days a week, after your classes," he said. "You help with basic maintenance jobs. I'll review your designs and answer questions about your father. But," he held up a finger, "if your grades slip or your mother objects strongly, the deal's off." Emily's face lit up. "Deal." She thrust out her hand, and Frank shook it, feeling like he just signed a contract whose fine print he hadn't fully read. "First lesson starts now," he said, gesturing to Mrs. Hutchinson's Buick. "Let's see what you make of this vacuum leak." As Emily eagerly rolled her chair closer to examine the engine, Frank felt a weight he'd carried for years shift slightly. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could bring Rob back or undo Frank's role in his death, but it was a step toward keeping his promise at last. The first week of their arrangement went smoothly enough. Emily proved to be a quick study, absorbing Frank's lessons on automotive repair while sharing her own designs for mobility devices. She asked about her father in small doses, his favorite tools, his mechanical quirks, the way he approached problems. Frank answered as honestly as he could while skirting the circumstances of Rob's death. It was during the second week that trouble arrived in the form of Vince Tucker, a perpetually angry customer whose ancient pickup truck required constant maintenance. "Reynolds!" Tucker shouted, storming into the garage while Frank was showing Emily how to diagnose a transmission issue. "That alternator you installed last month is already failing. I want a refund." Frank straightened up slowly, his bad knee protesting. "Let me take a look before jumping to conclusions." "Vince?" Tucker's gaze landed on Emily, his expression souring further. "What's this hiring cripples now? No wonder your work's going downhill." The garage went silent. Frank saw Emily's shoulders stiffen, her face carefully blank, a practiced response to ignorance. "Ms. Blackwood is an engineering student interning here," Frank said, his voice deceptively calm. "And I'd appreciate you watching your language in my garage." Tucker snorted. "Don't get all politically correct on me. Reynolds, just fix my damn truck. Some of us have real work to do." "Pop the hood," Frank said, his tone clipped. "Let's see this alternator problem." As Tucker stalked back to his truck, Emily rolled closer to Frank. I can go to the back office if I'm in the way, she offered quietly. You stay right where you are, Frank replied. This is part of the job, too, dealing with difficult customers. The alternator, as Frank suspected, wasn't failing. The battery terminals were corroded, a maintenance issue he'd warned Tucker about previously. As he cleaned the terminals with Emily watching, Tucker paced impatiently. How much is this going to cost me? He demanded. No charge, Frank said, tightening the last connection. This is maintenance you should be doing yourself. Vince, like I showed you last time. Tucker grunted, neither thanking Frank nor apologizing for his accusation. His gaze drifted to Emily again, his expression calculating. So what's your story? Girls' school project to make you feel useful. Before Frank could intervene, Emily fixed Tucker with a level stare. Actually, I'm designing a new type of mobility device. People like you are my inspiration. I figure if they can make trucks this reliable for people with limited capacity for preventive maintenance, surely we can make better wheelchairs. Frank had to turn away to hide his smile as Tucker's face reddened. Listen here, you little... Tucker started, taking a step toward Emily. Frank moved between them, all traces of humor gone. That's enough. Vince, your truck's fixed. Time for you to go. Tucker glared at Frank, then at Emily. You watch yourself. Reynolds, this town's changing. Won't be a place for outdated mechanics much longer. With that parting shot, he climbed into his truck and roared away, spewing exhaust. Sorry about that, Frank said once Tucker was gone. Some people never got past high school thinking. Emily shrugged, but Frank could see the encounter had bothered her. I'm used to it. Not everyone sees past the chair. Tucker's an ass to everyone, Frank assured her. Been that way since we were kids. Some folks just get more bitter with age. He hesitated, then added, Your father would have decked him for talking to you that way. That earned a small smile from Emily. Really, Mom always portrays him as calm and diplomatic, Frank snorted. Rob Blackwood had a temper when it came to bullies. Coolest head in a crisis, but zero tolerance for mean-spiritedness. He picked up a wrench, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. This one time in Saudi, there was this lieutenant who kept riding one of the younger privates. Real psychological stuff. Rob waited until we were alone in the motor pool, then told the lieutenant exactly what would happen if he didn't ease up. Did it work? Emily asked, leaning forward. Lieutenant requested a transfer the next day. Frank chuckled at the memory. Your dad had a way of making his point without raising his voice. Made people listen. Emily absorbed this new information about her father, filing it away. Were you friends, you and my dad? The question caught Frank off guard. We were close as you get in a war zone. Different backgrounds. He was college educated. I was a farm boy who joined up to escape small-town life, but we spoke the same language when it came to machines. Frank busied himself organizing tools, avoiding Emily's eyes. He talked about you and your mom all the time. Had pictures in his wallet, showed them to anyone who'd look. He wrote about you in his letters, Emily said quietly. Said you were the most trustworthy man he'd ever met. The words cut through Frank like a knife. If Rob had only known how that trust would be betrayed, how Frank's moment of hesitation would cost him everything. Let's get back to this transmission, Frank said gruffly, desperate to change the subject. Customers picking it up tomorrow. If Emily noticed his abrupt shift, she didn't comment on it. But as they returned to work, Frank felt her watching him with new interest, as if reassessing the puzzle he presented. Julia Blackwood arrived at the garage unannounced on Friday afternoon, just as Frank was teaching Emily how to properly tension a timing belt. Her nurse's scrubs were hidden beneath a heavy coat, but her posture radiated professional authority. Mom, Emily's surprise quickly shifted to a defensive stance. What are you doing here? When my daughter starts lying about her whereabouts 3 afternoons a week, I get concerned, Julia replied, her gaze moving from Emily to Frank. Especially when I discover she's spending time with someone who has every reason to avoid our family. Frank straightened up, wiping his hands reflexively. Mrs. Blackwood, I can explain. Can you, Sergeant Reynolds? Julia cut him off. Can you explain why, after 15 years of avoiding any contact with us, you suddenly take an interest in mentoring my daughter? Why you didn't identify yourself to her immediately during the storm? Emily looked between them, confusion clear on her face. Mom, what are you talking about? Frank served with Dad. That's all. Is that what he told you? Julia's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. Did he mention he was there when your father died? That Rob saved his life? The color drained from Emily's face. She turned to Frank, her expression a mix of shock and betrayal. Is that true? Frank felt cornered, the past he'd tried to outrun finally catching up to him. Yes, he admitted. Your father pushed me clear when we spotted the IED. There wasn't time for both of us to. And you never came to see us, Julia continued, her voice rising slightly. Never offered condolences or support. Robert considered you a brother, and you couldn't even face his family. Mom, that's enough, Emily said, sensing there was more to the story than she knew. Frank saved me in the storm. He's been teaching me, helping me with my designs. Out of guilt, Julia said flatly. Not genuine interest. Frank flinched at the accusation, partly because there was truth in it. His initial motivation had been guilt and obligation. But over the past 2 weeks, watching Emily's mind work, seeing her determination, it had become something more. Mrs. Blackwood, he said quietly, you have every right to be angry with me. I should have reached out years ago, but my interest in helping Emily now is genuine. She has real talent. Rob would be proud of her. Julia's expression softened slightly at the mention of her husband, but her resolve remained firm. Emily, it's time to go. I'm an adult, Emily protested. I get to decide who I spend time with. When you're living under my roof, using my insurance, and relying on me for transportation to medical appointments, you'll respect my wishes. Julia's tone made it clear this wasn't up for debate. Mr. Reynolds, I appreciate you helping Emily during the storm, but this arrangement is over. Frank saw the stubborn set of Emily's jaw, so like her father's, and jumped in before she could say something she'd regret. Your mother's right. Emily, this isn't worth causing a rift in your family. Emily stared at him in disbelief. You're taking her side just like that. I'm not taking sides, Frank said. I'm acknowledging your mother's authority and concerns. They're valid. The betrayal in Emily's eyes cut deep. She turned her wheelchair abruptly, moving toward the door. Fine, forget I ever asked for your help. Julia gave Frank a long look, not entirely antagonistic now, but still guarded, before following her daughter out. Through the garage windows, Frank watched them leave, Emily refusing her mother's help to get into their car, transferring herself with angry efficiency. As the car pulled away, Frank felt a familiar emptiness settle over him. He'd lost his chance to make things right with Rob's family, just as he'd lost his relationship with his own son years ago. Some mistakes, it seemed, couldn't be fixed, no matter how good you were with tools. The call came 3 days later, while Frank was reviewing his increasingly desperate financial options. The garage phone's ring echoed in the empty building. Customer traffic had slowed to a trickle as word of the impending foreclosure spread through Mapleton's rumor mill. Reynolds Auto, he answered mechanically. Frank. The voice was young, male, and vaguely familiar. It's David, your son. Frank nearly dropped the phone. David, is everything all right? His mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. His son only called when something was wrong. I'm fine, Dad. David's voice had the slightly exasperated tone Frank remembered from his teenage years. I'm calling because I got a strange email from someone named Emily Blackwood. Says she knows you. Frank sank into his office chair, bewildered. How did she get your contact information? She's pretty resourceful, found me through my company website, said it was important I talk to you before. David hesitated. Before you lose the garage, is that true? Is Bedford Trust foreclosing? Frank pressed a hand to his forehead. Of course, Emily would dig into his situation. The girl had an engineer's curiosity and a detective's persistence. It's just business. David, nothing for you to worry about. Like hell it isn't, David replied, a spark of the old arguments flaring up. That garage has been in our family for 3 generations. Why didn't you tell me things were this bad? You made it clear years ago you wanted nothing to do with Reynolds Auto, Frank said, regretting the bitterness that crept into his voice. You've got your life in California, your tech job. This is my problem. Dad, David's voice softened unexpectedly. I never wanted nothing to do with the garage. I wanted nothing to do with your expectations that I'd take it over someday. There's a difference. The distinction hit Frank like a physical blow. Had he really been so blind to his son's perspective? This Emily, David continued when Frank didn't respond. She said you saved her during the blizzard, that you've been helping her with some kind of mobility device design. She's exaggerating, Frank muttered. Just did what anyone would do. She also said you served with her father in Desert Storm, that he died saving you. Frank closed his eyes, the familiar guilt washing over him. Robert Blackwood, best damn mechanic in the unit. He spotted the IED first, pushed me clear. I hesitated. David, just for a second, but long enough that we couldn't both. His voice failed him. After a moment of silence, David asked quietly, Is that why you never talk about your service? Why you've been carrying this weight all these years? Frank couldn't answer, his throat tight with emotions he'd spent decades suppressing. I'm coming home, David said suddenly. Taking some personal leave. My flight gets in tomorrow evening. You don't need to do that, Frank protested automatically. I do. Actually, for both of us, David's tone was firm. And I'm bringing some ideas about how to save the garage. This Emily girl thinks you two could collaborate on something revolutionary. Said to tell you no job too small, no dream too big. The garage's old motto, passed down from Frank's father, sounded strange coming from his son's mouth. David, I appreciate the thought, but nothing. I'll see you tomorrow. We've got a lot to talk about. After David hung up, Frank sat motionless in his office chair, surrounded by the accumulated history of Reynolds Auto, service awards, vintage tools, photographs of 3 generations of mechanics. He'd been prepared to lose it all, had almost made peace with the idea. Now, unexpectedly, a sliver of hope had appeared from the most unlikely sources. His estranged son and the daughter of the man whose death had haunted him for 15 years. Frank didn't believe in signs or fate, but as a mechanic, he knew that sometimes, when you least expect it, a solution presents itself if you're willing to look at the problem from a different angle. Maybe it was time to try a new approach. The fire alarm split the air with its shrill warning just as Frank was finishing up the school bus transmission repair. He looked up in confusion, then saw smoke pouring from the small office where he kept his financial records. Hell! Frank grabbed the nearest fire extinguisher and rushed toward the office. But the smoke was already thickening, flames visible behind the glass partition. The ancient space heater he'd been using to cut costs had finally given out, igniting the stack of papers beside it. Frank tried to reach the office door, but the heat pushed him back. Through the smoke, he spotted something that made his heart stop: the bus keys on his workbench. The school bus was blocked in by his tow truck. No way to move it quickly, and the flames were spreading rapidly across the oil-stained concrete toward the vehicle. He grabbed the shop phone, dialing 911 with one hand while using the extinguisher with the other. But the flames were gaining ground faster than he could fight them. The dispatcher promised fire trucks within minutes, but Frank knew that might not be soon enough. A sudden crash from the main entrance sent Frank spinning around, extinguisher raised. Through the thickening smoke, he saw a wheelchair burst through the side door. Emily Blackwood propelling herself forward with powerful strokes. Emily, get out of here, Frank shouted, horrified. The place is going up. The school bus, she yelled back, pointing to where flames were approaching the vehicle. Ms. Ortiz dropped off her second-grade class at the library next door. They need that bus in 20 minutes. Before Frank could respond, Emily was already moving toward the bus, pulling herself out of her wheelchair and up into the driver's seat with practiced ease. Get that tow truck moved. Heartwarming, she called over her shoulder, reaching for the ignition. Frank didn't waste time arguing. He ran for the tow truck, yanking the door open and starting the engine. The heat was becoming unbearable, smoke filling the garage despite the open bay doors. He maneuvered the truck forward, clearing a path for the bus. Through the smoke, he saw Emily behind the wheel, face set in concentration as she started the massive vehicle. The bus lurched forward just as a section of the ceiling collapsed where it had been parked moments before. Frank guided the tow truck outside, then turned back to see the bus emerging from the garage. Emily driving with the confidence of someone who'd practiced this movement countless times. She pulled the bus to safety across the street just as the first fire truck arrived, sirens wailing. Firefighters rushed past Frank, hoses deployed to battle the blaze consuming his livelihood. He stumbled toward the bus, where Emily was carefully transferring back into her wheelchair, which she'd somehow managed to bring along. Are you out of your mind? Frank demanded when he reached her, his relief making his voice sharper than intended. You could have been killed. I saw the smoke from the library, Emily explained, her face streaked with soot. Figured you might need help. Good thing I know how to drive these buses. Mom made sure I got my CDL with adaptive controls last year. Frank stared at her in disbelief. You have a commercial driver's license for buses? Mom believes in over-preparation. Emily shrugged, then looked back at the garage, where firefighters were making progress against the flames. I'm sorry about the garage. Frank, is it insured? The question brought Frank crashing back to reality. Insurance lapsed last month, he admitted, watching years of family history disappear in smoke and flame. Couldn't keep up with the payments. Emily's expression fell. Oh, Frank. Ms. Blackwood, Mr. Reynolds. A woman's voice cut through the chaos. The school librarian, Ms. Ortiz, was hurrying toward them, a group of wide-eyed second graders trailing behind her like ducklings. Thank God you saved the bus. Is everyone all right? We're fine, Frank assured her, though he felt anything but fine as he watched his life's work burn. You're heroes, one of the children exclaimed, staring at Emily with undisguised admiration. You drove through fire. Emily smiled weakly. Not exactly through it, buddy, just away from it. As Ms. Ortiz gathered her charges, promising them an exciting story to tell their parents, Frank noticed a familiar car pulling up to the scene. Julia Blackwood emerged, still in her nurse's scrubs, her face a mask of fear as she spotted her daughter near the burning building. Emily, she cried, rushing over. What happened? Are you hurt? I'm fine, Mom, Emily assured her. I was at the library when the fire started. Frank and I got the school bus out before it could be damaged. Julia's gaze moved from her daughter to Frank, then to the burning garage. Some of the tension left her shoulders as she verified Emily was unharmed, but her expression remained troubled. Thank you for helping her, she said to Frank, her voice formal but not unfriendly. Other way around, Frank replied honestly. She's the one who drove the bus out, has the reflexes of a professional driver. Julia's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. She gets that from her father. Robert could drive anything with wheels. Her expression sobered as she looked at the firefighters battling the blaze. What will you do now? Frank shook his head, the reality of his situation sinking in. The garage was likely a total loss, and without insurance, there would be no rebuilding. The bank would claim the land, and Reynolds Auto would cease to exist after 3 generations. My son's flying in tonight, he said, more to himself than to Julia. First time in 5 years. Guess I'll have to tell him he came all this way for nothing. Before Julia could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. Frank Reynolds. Frank turned to see a young man in an army uniform, mid-20s, with the ramrod straight posture of a recent combat veteran. His right pant leg was pinned up neatly below the knee, and he supported himself on high-tech crutches. Sergeant Zach Harris, the young man introduced himself with a crisp nod. I'm a patient of Dr. Garrett's at the VA. He suggested I look you up about a project he's working on. Harris glanced at the burning garage, then back at Frank. Though I guess I should have called first. Dr. Garrett, Emily perked up. Dr. Michael Garrett, the prosthetics specialist. Harris nodded. That's him. He's been trying to develop better mobility options for vets, but the VA funding keeps getting cut. Said you might be interested in collaboration since you have experience with adaptive engineering. He looked uncertainly between Frank and Emily. Though I'm not sure who he meant now. Both of us, Emily said without hesitation, looking at Frank with renewed determination. We've been working on mobility solutions together. Frank started to correct her, then stopped. In the midst of losing everything, a strange possibility was taking shape in his mind. His son arriving with ideas to save the garage, Emily's persistent interest in adaptive technology, and now this veteran with a connection to a medical specialist. Maybe, just maybe, there was a different path forward than the one he'd resigned himself to. Why don't we continue this conversation somewhere less smoky? Julia suggested, surprising everyone. The diner across town stays open late. My treat. She met Frank's eyes, her expression unreadable but not unwelcoming. Sounds like we all have a lot to discuss. As they made their way to their respective vehicles, Frank paused for one last look at Reynolds Auto, the business his grandfather had started, his father had built, and he had failed to save. The roof was collapsing now, sending sparks into the evening sky. An ending, certainly. But as he watched Emily efficiently transfer into her mother's car, already deep in conversation with Sergeant Harris about prosthetic limitations, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the spark of a new beginning. His son was coming home. Rob Blackwood's daughter was bursting with ideas and determination. A doctor needed engineering help for wounded veterans, and Frank Reynolds still had a lifetime of mechanical knowledge to share. Perhaps it wasn't too late for a second chance after all. The Mapleton Diner hadn't changed in 30 years. The same vinyl booths, the same flickering neon sign, the same coffee that could strip paint. As Frank slid into a booth across from Julia Blackwood, he felt like he'd stepped into a time capsule from his youth. I worked here during high school, Julia remarked, glancing around. Used to serve your father when he'd come in after closing the garage. He always ordered apple pie and black coffee. Frank nodded, surprised she remembered. Dad said diners had the best pie because they couldn't afford to waste ingredients on bad recipes. A small silence fell between them, weighted with shared history and unspoken regrets. Across the diner, Emily and Sergeant Harris were huddled at the counter, examining something on Emily's tablet, their conversation animated despite having just met. She's so much like him, Julia said quietly, following Frank's gaze. Not just her looks, but the way her mind works. Always solving problems, always questioning. I noticed, Frank replied. She's got real talent. The wheelchair modifications she's designed are impressive. Julia's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. That's what worries me. Rob was the same way. So focused on fixing things, on making everything better, that he didn't always see the dangers. She met Frank's eyes directly. Is that what happened in Desert Storm? The question Frank had dreaded for 15 years hung between them. He took a deep breath, knowing Julia deserved the truth. We were on a routine patrol. Transport convoy hit an IED 2 clicks ahead of us. Rob and I went forward to assess the damage, see if we could get the vehicles moving again. Frank's voice grew distant as the memory surfaced. Rob was under the hood of the lead Humvee when he spotted the second device. It was wired differently, meant to take out the rescue team. Julia didn't speak, just watched him with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. He shouted a warning. I hesitated, just for a second, looking for the trigger mechanism instead of running. Rob pushed me clear, but he didn't have time to. Frank's voice faltered. It should have been me. He had a family. I had nobody depending on me. So that's why you never reached out, Julia said, understanding dawning in her eyes. You blamed yourself. Wouldn't you, if our positions had been reversed? Julia considered this, her nurse's pragmatism evident in her measured response. For a while, perhaps, but Rob made his choice. Frank, he would have done the same for any of his unit. That's who he was. That doesn't make it right, Frank insisted. I should have been there for you and Emily afterward. I promised him I would be. When Julia asked sharply, when did you promise him that? Frank rubbed his weathered face. Every time he showed me your pictures, every time he talked about Emily's future. It wasn't a formal oath, but it was understood. If anything happened to him. But nothing was supposed to happen to him, Julia said, a hint of the old grief surfacing. He was a mechanic, not frontline infantry. He was supposed to come home. The guilt that had been Frank's constant companion for 15 years rose up again, threatening to overwhelm him. But before he could respond, the diner door swung open, bringing a blast of cold air and a man Frank almost didn't recognize. David Reynolds stood in the doorway, overnight bag in hand, his California tan looking out of place in an Ohio winter. At 35, he had Frank's build but his mother's gentler features. His business casual attire and tech company lanyard marked him as someone who had left Mapleton far behind. Dad, he said, spotting Frank and crossing to their booth. I came straight from the airport. Sheriff Gaines told me about the fire. Are you okay? Frank stood, suddenly awkward in his son's presence. They hadn't seen each other in 5 years. Not since Sarah's funeral. I'm fine. Just some smoke inhalation. They attempted a handshake that turned into a stiff half-hug, both men unsure of the appropriate greeting after so much time apart. David, this is Julia Blackwood, Frank said, grateful for the distraction. Julia, my son David. Mrs. Blackwood, David nodded politely. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Please call me Julia, she replied, then gestured toward the counter. And that's my daughter Emily, talking with Sergeant Harris. David's eyes widened in recognition. Emily Blackwood, the one who emailed me. At the sound of her name, Emily looked up, then wheeled over to their booth, Sergeant Harris following with his distinctive gait. You must be David, she said, extending her hand. Thanks for coming. I wasn't sure you would. Hard to ignore an email with the subject line, your dad needs you even if he won't admit it. David replied with a small smile. Shaking her hand, Frank looked between them, feeling distinctly outmaneuvered. You two have been conspiring behind my back. Not conspiring, Emily corrected. Coordinating. Different thing entirely. Semantic distinction aside, Julia cut in. I think we all need to understand what's happening here. Why did Dr. Garrett send you to Frank? Sergeant Harris. Zach Harris straightened slightly, as if giving a formal report. Dr. Garrett has been developing improved prosthetics and mobility devices for veterans. But he's hit a wall with both funding and engineering. The VA keeps cutting his budget, and the commercial options are either too expensive or too generic for combat injuries. He gestured to his missing lower leg. Standard prosthetics don't account for the kind of tissue and nerve damage we often have. And he thought Frank could help, David asked, glancing at his father. Actually, he mentioned both Reynolds Auto and Emily Blackwood, Harris clarified. Said he'd read about Emily's engineering award for adaptive wheel designs in the college newsletter, and knew Frank had a reputation for innovative mechanical solutions. All eyes turned to Emily, who looked slightly embarrassed. It was just a small departmental award. I submitted my modified wheelchair hub design, the one Frank helped me improve during the blizzard. Dr. Garrett thinks there's potential for collaboration, Harris continued. combining medical knowledge with practical engineering to create better mobility solutions. But he glanced toward the window, where a faint orange glow still lit the sky, where Reynolds Auto had stood. I'm guessing a garage fire complicates things. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Frank felt the weight of lost opportunities pressing down on him. Without his garage, without tools or workspace, what could he possibly offer? Maybe not, David said suddenly, pulling out his phone. The fire might actually create an opportunity. He placed the phone on the table, displaying a property listing. The old Hendricks manufacturing building on the east side of town. It's been empty since they moved operations to Mexico in 2008. The bank owns it now. Frank frowned at the image of the abandoned factory. What about it? I've been looking into it for months, David admitted, thinking about remote work options. The tech industry is changing. Not everything has to happen in Silicon Valley anymore. He swiped to another image, showing the building's interior. 20,000 square feet of industrial space with existing workshop infrastructure. Needs updating, but the bones are good. And this relates to our current situation, how? Julia asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to connect the dots. David looked at his father, then at Emily and Harris. What if we turned it into a combined auto shop and adaptive technology development center? The front portion could remain Reynolds Auto, serving the community like always. The back could be workspace for developing and testing mobility devices. Frank stared at his son, thrown by both the idea and the revelation that David had been considering a return to Mapleton. Son, I appreciate the thought, but I just lost everything. No insurance, no capital, and the bank's about to foreclose on what's left. Not everything, Emily interjected. You still have your knowledge, your reputation, and, she glanced at Harris, potential partners with complementary skills. Harris nodded. Dr. Garrett has medical expertise and connections to the VA patient population. What he lacks is the engineering and practical application side. And I have connections to venture capital firms specializing in assistive technology, David added. Part of my job at Horizon Tech is evaluating potential investments in the medical device sector. Frank looked around the table, momentarily overwhelmed by the rapid shift from total loss to possible new beginning. This all sounds great in theory, but without startup capital, that might not be as big an obstacle as you think, said a new voice. Frank turned to see Richard Bedford standing beside their booth. The president of Bedford Trust Bank was dressed in his usual impeccable suit despite the late hour, his expression unreadable. Richard, Frank acknowledged warily, come to deliver the foreclosure papers in person. Bedford shook his head. I heard about the fire on the police scanner. Thought I should check on things personally. He glanced around the table, then back to Frank. Could I have a word in private? Frank excused himself and followed Bedford to a quiet corner of the diner, bracing for the final blow to his financial situation. Frank, I've known you since high school, Bedford began, surprising Frank with his informal tone. Our fathers did business together for 40 years. Reynolds Auto has been a Mapleton institution since before either of us was born. And now it's gone, Frank said flatly. If you're here to tell me I still owe the balance of my loan, I'm aware. Bedford sighed. Actually, I'm here with a proposition. My father recently moved into assisted living. His Parkinson's has progressed to the point where he needs specialized care. Frank frowned, uncertain where this was going. I'm sorry to hear that. John was always good to my family. Yes. Well, he's been asking about you, reminiscing about how your father kept his first delivery trucks running during the bank's early days. Bedford straightened his tie, looking uncomfortable. The point is, he was quite upset when he learned I'd initiated foreclosure proceedings against Reynolds Auto. Business is business, Frank said, though the bitterness in his voice belied his words. Perhaps, Bedford conceded. But my father reminded me that banking, at its core, should serve the community. And sometimes that means looking beyond the immediate balance sheet. He produced a folder from his briefcase. This is a revised loan proposal. It would consolidate your existing debt and provide capital for relocation and equipment replacement. Frank took the folder cautiously, scanning the terms with disbelief. These rates are well below market, and this grace period is contingent on the formation of a legitimate business partnership focused on developing the adaptive technology your group was just discussing. Bedford nodded toward their table. Yes, I overheard enough to understand the general concept. It's exactly the kind of innovative repurposing of local talent that Mapleton needs. Frank studied Bedford's face, looking for the catch. Why would you do this? The bank would make more by foreclosing and selling the property. Bedford's professional demeanor slipped slightly. Because my father reminded me that your father rebuilt his first car engine when no one else would take the job. Because my nephew lost his leg in Afghanistan and uses a prosthetic that costs more than a luxury car but works less reliably than a Ford Pinto. He straightened, regaining his banker's composure. And because diversifying Mapleton's economy with a medical technology venture represents a sound long-term investment for the bank. Frank looked down at the proposal, then back at the table where his son, Emily, Julia, and Harris were watching expectantly. It wasn't just his future being decided in this moment, he realized. It was all of theirs. I need to discuss this with my partners, Frank said, the word feeling strange on his tongue. Bedford nodded. Take 24 hours, but Frank, he added as Frank turned to go, don't let pride stand in the way of something good. That's a lesson it took me too long to learn. Frank returned to the booth, the proposal folder clutched in his hand like a lifeline. What did Bedford want? David asked, tension evident in his voice. Frank placed the folder on the table. To offer us a chance. The old Hendricks manufacturing building loomed against the morning sky, its red brick facade blackened with decades of industrial grime. Broken windows dotted its upper stories like missing teeth, and the faded company logo was barely visible above the main entrance. It's perfect, Emily declared, wheeling herself along the cracked concrete path toward the building. Look at those loading docks, ideal for accessible entrances with some modification. Frank was less enthusiastic as he surveyed the dilapidated structure. Roof's probably shot. Electrical will need a complete overhaul. Plumbing, too, most likely. But the infrastructure is sound, David countered, consulting the inspection report on his tablet. Steel frame construction, reinforced concrete floors. The main manufacturing space has 30-foot ceilings and overhead crane rails still intact. Julia walked a few paces behind them, her expression caught between hope and concern. It's certainly spacious enough, but the renovation costs are accounted for in Bedford's loan proposal, David assured her. Plus, I've been in contact with a developer friend who specializes in adaptive reuse of industrial buildings. He thinks we could qualify for several historic preservation and economic development grants. Frank ran a hand along the building's exterior wall, feeling the solid craftsmanship beneath the grime. The kind of construction they didn't do anymore, built to last generations, not just until the warranty expired. What do you think, Dad? David asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Despite his confident business planning, Frank realized his son still sought his approval. Before Frank could answer, a sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Dr. Michael Garrett emerged, his silver hair and bow tie giving him the appearance of a distinguished academic rather than a VA medical specialist. He helped Harris out of the passenger side, waiting patiently as the young sergeant adjusted his prosthetic. Quite the potential you've got here, Dr. Garrett called as he approached, surveying the building with an appraising eye. Reminds me of the warehouse where Apple got started. Or was it Microsoft? Neither, David corrected with a smile. But I appreciate the optimistic comparison. Introductions were made as the group gathered near the main entrance. Dr. Garrett shook Frank's hand with unexpected strength for a man in his 60s. I've heard good things about your mechanical ingenuity, Mr. Reynolds. Harris tells me you kept half the town's vehicles running on spit and baling wire during the recession. Frank shrugged uncomfortably. Just did what needed doing. That's precisely the attitude we need, Garrett enthused. The medical device industry is drowning in theoretical engineers who've never actually built anything with their hands. They design prosthetics that look impressive in boardroom presentations, but fail in the real world. He turned to Emily, his expression softening. And Ms. Blackwood, your designs for the adaptive wheel hub system show remarkable insight, particularly your approach to torque distribution across variable terrain. Emily blushed slightly. That was actually inspired by something Frank showed me, how differential gearing in cars distributes power to wheels with different traction needs. Garrett nodded appreciatively. Cross-disciplinary application. The best innovations often come from applying principles from one field to another. He gestured toward the building. Shall we take a look inside? I'm eager to see if the space could accommodate a proper testing facility. As Bedford's key unlocked the massive front doors, Frank found himself holding back. Suddenly overwhelmed by the scale of what they were considering, his entire life had been spent in the modest family garage, working on one vehicle at a time, making incremental improvements to existing technologies. This was something else entirely. David noticed his hesitation. You okay, Dad? Just wondering what your grandfather would think of all this, Frank replied honestly. Reynolds Auto has always been about fixing what's broken, not inventing something new. David considered this, then said, I think Grandpa would say that sometimes the thing that needs fixing most isn't a car or a wheelchair. Sometimes it's a purpose. The insight, so simple yet profound, caught Frank off guard. When had his son become so wise before he could respond? A commotion at the far end of the parking lot drew their attention. A black Mercedes pulled in aggressively, cutting off Bedford's more modest sedan. The man who emerged wore an expensive suit and the expression of practiced condescension. Vaughn Porter, Bedford muttered, his friendly banker demeanor instantly cooling. CEO of Meditech Industries, and, it seems, still lacking basic parking courtesy. Porter strode toward them with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. Richard thought I might find you here. Your assistant mentioned you were showing the Hendricks building again. His gaze swept over the group, lingering dismissively on Emily's wheelchair and Harris's prosthetic before settling on Frank. Reynolds, isn't it heard about your unfortunate fire? Terrible thing, losing a family business? Frank felt an immediate dislike for the man, though they'd never formally met. Porter represented everything Frank distrusted. Slick, corporate, with the shark-like smile of someone who profited from others' misfortunes. Mr. Porter, Bedford acknowledged stiffly, I wasn't aware you had interest in this property. Oh, I have interest in everything happening in Mapleton, Porter replied smoothly. Especially when it involves potential competition for Meditech. We are the region's largest medical device manufacturer. After all, Dr. Garrett stepped forward, his academic politeness barely concealing contempt. Ah, Vaughn, still producing those overpriced wheelchairs with planned obsolescence built into every component. Porter's smile tightened. Michael, still tinkering with prototype prosthetics that never quite make it to market. How's the VA funding these days? Still dwindling. The tension between the men was palpable. Frank glanced at Bedford, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Porter, Bedford interjected, I'm conducting a private showing of this property at the moment. Perhaps we could schedule a time for you to view it later. Porter laughed, the sound without warmth. No need. I've seen it many times. In fact, I've had an offer on the table for this building for 6 months. He turned to Frank and David. Whatever Richard's offering you, I'll double it. The Reynolds name still has value in this town. Even without the garage, Meditech could use that kind of local credibility. Emily wheeled forward, her expression fierce. The Reynolds name isn't for sale, Mr. Porter, and neither is our project. Porter's gaze hardened as he looked down at her. Ah, the Blackwood girl. I've heard about your little wheelchair modifications. Clever hobby, but medical device development is a professional business requiring substantial capital and regulatory expertise, which is why they have me, Dr. Garrett cut in, and Mr. Reynolds's mechanical expertise and David's connections to Silicon Valley venture capital. For the first time, Porter looked less than completely confident. His eyes narrowed as he assessed the group with new consideration. I see. Well, this makes our conversation even more relevant. He reached into his jacket, producing a business card that he handed to Frank. When this amateur collaboration inevitably runs into FDA regulatory hurdles or manufacturing challenges, give me a call. Meditech is always looking to acquire promising intellectual property. Without waiting for a response, Porter turned and walked back to his Mercedes, his message delivered. Well, Julia said into the silence that followed. That was unexpected. Not really, Bedford sighed. Porter's been trying to expand Meditech's reach in Mapleton for years. The man collects struggling businesses like trophies. Frank stared at the business card in his hand, then deliberately tucked it into his pocket rather than discarding it. Know your enemy, his military training suggested. Does his presence change anything? He asked Bedford. The banker shook his head. Not from the bank's perspective, but you should be aware. Porter plays hardball. If he sees your venture as competition, he'll come at you with everything he's got. Then we better make sure what we're building is worth fighting for, Frank said, surprising himself with his resolve. He turned toward the open doors of the Hendricks building, where sunlight now streamed through broken windows, illuminating possibilities. Let's see what we're working with. 6 weeks later, the transformation of the old Hendricks building was well underway. The front section had been renovated into a modern version of Reynolds Auto, with 3 service bays and updated equipment salvaged from insurance and purchased with Bedford's loan. The larger rear section was in the process of becoming what Emily had dubbed the Second Chance Workshop, a combined research on development and testing facility for adaptive mobility devices. Frank stood in what would become the main fabrication area, watching as workers installed specialized equipment. The overhead crane system had been refurbished, now able to lift and move heavy components with precision. Workbenches custom-built to accommodate both standing workers and wheelchair users lined the walls. Dad, David called from the mezzanine level that would house their design offices. The 3D printers just arrived. Need your input on placement. Frank still found it surreal to be working alongside his son after so many years apart. More surprising was how well they complemented each other. Frank's practical, hands-on approach balancing David's technical expertise and business acumen. As he climbed the stairs to the mezzanine, Frank passed Harris, who was testing the building's newly installed wheelchair ramp gradient with Emily. Too steep at the top transition, Harris was saying, demonstrating with his crutches. Creates a tipping point for someone with upper body weakness? Emily nodded, making notes on her tablet. We'll adjust the angle and add a textured surface for better traction. Good catch. Their easy collaboration had become the norm over the past weeks. Harris's experience as a prosthetic user made him an invaluable tester, while Emily's engineering mind quickly translated user feedback into design modifications. The rapid progress on the facility was encouraging, but Frank knew they faced a more significant challenge actually developing a marketable product. Dr. Garrett's prosthetic prototypes were innovative, but far from commercially viable. Emily's adaptive wheelchair designs needed extensive testing and refinement, and looming over everything was Porter's shadow. Meditech had already tried to poach one of their newly hired engineers with promises of double salary. The big one goes against that wall, Frank told David, pointing to where power outlets had been installed for the industrial 3D printer. We'll need reinforced flooring underneath. That thing weighs as much as a small car. David made a note, then hesitated. There's something else we need to discuss. I've been going over the financials with Bedford. The renovation costs are running higher than estimated, and our runway is getting shorter. Frank nodded grimly. He'd expected this. Construction projects always went over budget, and they were trying to create specialized facilities on a shoestring. How bad? We need a working prototype to show investors within 3 months, or we'll miss the next funding cycle. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his younger self that Frank felt a pang of nostalgia. And even with Dr. Garrett's VA connections, we're still navigating a regulatory maze for clinical testing. Before Frank could respond, a commotion at the main entrance caught their attention. Julia burst in, still wearing her nurse's scrubs, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. "You need to see this," she called up to them, holding up her phone. "Channel 7 News, right now." David quickly pulled up the local news stream on his tablet. The others gathered around as the anchor's voice filled the mezzanine. Exclusive report on alleged safety violations at Meditech Industries, the region's largest medical device manufacturer. Internal documents leaked to Channel 7 reveal that the company may have knowingly shipped wheelchair models with defective braking systems to reduce costs. The report continued, showing hidden camera footage of Meditech wheelchairs failing safety tests, followed by internal memos discussing the decision to ship them anyway. "This is huge," Emily whispered. "Those are the same models used by half the patients at Mapleton General. And every VA hospital in 3 states?" Harris added, his expression darkening. The news anchor's voice grew more serious. "Meditech CEO Vaughn Porter declined our request for an interview, but the company issued a statement calling the allegations baseless and promising a full internal investigation." "Porter's going to bury this," Dr. Garrett predicted, joining them from his makeshift office. "He's got half the state regulators in his pocket and enough lawyers to delay any meaningful consequences for years." Frank studied the tablet screen, where images of the defective wheelchairs were being shown alongside tearful interviews with families affected by accidents. One case involved a Vietnam veteran whose wheelchair had failed on a ramp, causing injuries that exacerbated his existing health problems. "Maybe," Frank said slowly, an idea taking shape. "Or maybe this is exactly the opportunity we need." The others looked at him questioningly. Porter's built his business on cutting corners and inflated prices, knowing most customers don't have alternatives, Frank explained. "What if we could fast-track our first product, not a completely revolutionary design, but a safety retrofit kit for existing Meditech wheelchairs?" Emily caught on immediately. "A brake system upgrade that could be installed on their current models. We already have most of the components designed from my earlier work. And I could get VA approval for a safety modification much faster than for an entirely new device?" Dr. Garrett added, his bow tie quivering with excitement. David was already calculating on his tablet. Production costs would be manageable, especially at scale, and the market is predefined. Every Meditech wheelchair owner is now a potential customer. "We'd need to move fast," Julia cautioned, "before Porter finds a way to discredit the story or issues his own recall." Frank nodded, feeling a surge of purpose. "Then let's get to work. David, coordinate with Bedford on emergency funding for materials. Emily, finalize the brake system design for manufacturing. Dr. Garrett, start the VA approval process. Harris, we'll be your first tester." Harris finished with a grim smile. "I've still got my old Meditech chair from before the VA upgraded me. Been using it as a doorstop, but I can resurrect it for the cause." As the group dispersed to their tasks, Julia remained beside Frank, watching him with a thoughtful expression. "What?" he asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You're in your element," she observed, "solving problems, leading a team. It suits you." Frank shrugged uncomfortably. "Just doing what needs doing." Julia's expression softened. "That's what Rob always said about you. Frank Reynolds does what needs doing, no matter what. He'd be proud to see you now." The mention of Rob no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, Frank felt a bittersweet connection to his lost friend, as if their interrupted story was finding a new chapter through Emily and this unlikely venture. "I hope so," he said quietly. "I really hope so." The second step safety retrofit kit rolled into production exactly 2 months after the Meditech scandal broke. What had begun as a rapid response to a competitor's failure had evolved into a comprehensive safety upgrade for virtually any wheelchair on the market. The initial focus on braking systems had expanded to include stability enhancements, improved bearings based on Emily's original designs, and a revolutionary adjustable hand rim that made propulsion easier for users with limited hand strength. Frank stood in the newly completed assembly area, watching as the first production run moved through quality control. Harris supervised a team of technicians, all veterans hired through a VA employment program, performing final checks on each kit before packaging. 98% pass rate on first inspection, Harris reported, his prosthetic leg now sporting a prototype enhancement developed in their workshop. That's industry-leading quality control. Frank nodded, satisfaction warming his chest. How's the new leg component working out? Harris demonstrated a fluid movement that would have been impossible with his standard prosthetic. The adaptive ankle joint is a game changer. Lets me navigate uneven surfaces without constantly readjusting my gait. That's the next product line. Then, Frank decided, once we've established market presence with the wheelchair kits, the sound of rapid wheelchair movement announced Emily's arrival. She wheeled into the assembly area at high speed, her chair now equipped with every innovation they developed. First orders are already coming in, she announced breathlessly. The VA has approved the kit for all 17 regional hospitals, and 3 private healthcare networks have placed bulk orders. Frank allowed himself a small smile. How's Porter taking the news? Emily's grin turned mischievous. According to Dr. Garrett's contacts, he's apoplectic. Meditech stock dropped 12% when our press release went out. Don't celebrate too soon, David cautioned, joining them with his ever-present tablet. Porter's legal team has already filed a patent challenge against 2 of our components, claiming they're too similar to Meditech's proprietary designs. Frank's satisfaction dimmed. Any merit to their claims? David shook his head. Our designs are fundamentally different, emphasizing safety and user control rather than corporate convenience and planned obsolescence. But the legal battle could drain resources we don't have. We expected this, Frank reminded him. Porter was never going to let us succeed without a fight. And we're not backing down, Emily declared, her father's determination evident in her voice. Not when we're already helping people. As if to underscore her point, the main doors opened to admit Dr. Garrett accompanied by an elderly man in a wheelchair, their first non-veteran customer. Frank recognized him immediately as John Bedford, Richard's father and the former president of Bedford Trust Bank. Mr. Bedford, Frank greeted him, crossing the workshop floor. This is an unexpected honor. The elder Bedford's hands shook with Parkinson's tremors, but his mind remained sharp. Couldn't let the young people have all the excitement, he said, his voice wavering but determined. Richard tells me you're revolutionizing wheelchair safety. Thought I'd see for myself. Dr. Garrett beamed proudly. Mr. Bedford has volunteered to be our first civilian beta tester for the complete system, not just the retrofit kit. We've adapted one of our prototypes to his specific needs, Emily explained, wheeling over to demonstrate the modifications on Bedford's chair. Custom hand controls to compensate for his tremors, improved stability for transitioning between surfaces, and our new braking system. As Emily showed the elder banker how to operate the enhanced controls, Frank noticed Richard Bedford watching from near the entrance, his expression a mix of gratitude and professional assessment. Frank excused himself to join him. Your father seems pleased, Frank observed. Bedford nodded. More than pleased. This is the most engaged I've seen him in months. The care facility says his depression has lifted since he heard about your project. He cleared his throat. The bank's board is impressed as well. Initial orders exceeding projections. Positive press coverage. VA contracts secured. You've defied expectations. We got lucky with the Meditech scandal, Frank admitted. Luck favors the prepared, Bedford countered. You identified an opportunity and executed quickly. That's good business. His expression grew more serious. Porter's not taking it well, though. He's called in favors with the county commissioners, challenging your occupancy permits on technicalities. Frank had expected as much. We're up to code. The inspectors were thorough. Yes, but bureaucratic delays can be just as damaging as outright denials. Bedford straightened his tie, a nervous habit Frank had noticed. There's something else. Porter approached the bank about acquiring your loan. That was unexpected. Can he do that? Technically, yes. The bank could sell your debt to a third party, but, Bedford added quickly, seeing Frank's expression darken. The board unanimously rejected his offer. The Reynolds-Blackwood venture aligns with our community reinvestment goals far better than Porter's corporate consolidation strategy. Frank felt a rush of gratitude toward the banker he'd once viewed as an adversary. Thank you, Richard. Bedford waved away his thanks. Just sound banking. Porter represents the past, extractive, exploitative business models. You represent the future, adaptive, community-centered innovation. He gestured toward his father, now laughing as Emily demonstrated how the chair could execute a tight turn. And on a personal note, I haven't seen my father smile like that since before my mother passed. Across the workshop, David was deep in conversation with Dr. Garrett and Harris, the three men examining a prosthetic component with intense focus. Julia had arrived from her hospital shift and was chatting with the veteran assembly team, her nurse's perspective offering valuable insights on user needs. The scene struck Frank with unexpected force. This diverse group united in purpose, creating something meaningful in a space that had stood empty for years. It wasn't just wheelchairs and prosthetics they were rebuilding. It was lives, community, purpose, including his own. Porter will keep coming, Frank said, more to himself than to Bedford. He can't stand being challenged. Bedford nodded grimly. That's why your next steps are critical. The retrofit kits are a strong start, but you need a truly breakthrough product to secure your position. We're working on it, Frank assured him, thinking of the advanced prosthetic prototypes taking shape in their development lab. But these things take time to perfect. Time may be a luxury you don't have, Bedford warned. Porter has resources and connections you can't match. Your advantage is innovation and authenticity. Don't lose sight of that. As Bedford moved to join his father, Frank remained by the entrance, surveying the workshop with a mechanic's eye for potential weaknesses. They'd accomplished so much in a short time, but Bedford was right. They remained vulnerable. The retrofit kits were a clever response to immediate need, but not the revolutionary change they'd set out to create. Somewhere between Emily's adaptive wheelchair designs, Dr. Garrett's medical expertise, and Frank's mechanical innovations lay a truly transformative product, if they could find it before Porter found a way to crush them. The attack, when it came, was more brutal than any of them had anticipated. Frank was awakened at 2 a.m. by his phone's insistent ringing. David's voice was tight with controlled panic. Dad, you need to get to the workshop now. There's been a break-in. 20 minutes later, Frank stood in the center of their development lab, surveying the devastation. Prototype components lay scattered and broken across the floor. Computer equipment had been smashed, design files stolen. Most concerning, their advanced prosthetic prototype, the breakthrough product they'd been refining for weeks, was missing entirely. Sheriff Gaines moved carefully through the wreckage, documenting the scene. Professional job, he noted grimly. Disabled the alarm system, knew exactly what they were looking for. This wasn't random vandalism. Frank didn't need to be told who was behind it. Any cameras catch them. External security footage shows 3 individuals in masks, Gaines replied. They arrived in a van with stolen plates. Clean operation. Emily wheeled through the door, face pale with shock as she took in the destruction. Julia followed close behind, immediately moving to comfort her daughter. Our work, Emily whispered, picking up a shattered component, part of the adaptive control system she designed. Everything we've built. Not everything, David said firmly, emerging from the server room. They got our local machines, but our cloud backups are secure. We still have the design files, the test data, everything we need to rebuild. But not the prototype, Dr. Garrett observed, examining the empty workbench where their most advanced model had been secured. 3 months of refinement, gone. Frank felt cold anger settling in his chest. This wasn't just business competition. It was personal. Porter hadn't just stolen their work. He'd violated their space, attacked their dream. We rebuild, Frank said, his voice cutting through the group's despondency. Starting now. Frank, be realistic, Julia urged. Even with the backup files, it took us months to get that prototype working. The materials alone. Will be replaced, Bedford interrupted, striding through the door with determination unusual for the typically reserved banker. The bank is treating this as an attack on a key community investment. We're expediting an insurance claim and extending emergency capital. Harris, who had been silently examining the break-in point, spoke up. My VA contacts need to be notified immediately. If someone's using our stolen prototype as a template, they could produce dangerous knockoffs. Already on it, Dr. Garrett assured him, phone in hand. I've also notified the FDA about potential safety concerns from stolen medical device designs. Frank watched his team mobilize in the face of disaster, each person instinctively taking on critical tasks without needing direction. Pride momentarily displaced his anger. They'd come together as a real team, forged through shared purpose and now shared adversity. David, Frank said, making a decision. Contact your Silicon Valley connections. It's time to accelerate our timeline. David looked surprised. The venture capital pitch. We're not ready without the prototype. We don't have the luxury of waiting anymore, Frank replied. Porter's shown his hand. He's desperate enough to resort to criminal tactics, which means we're a genuine threat. We need to capitalize on that before he finds another way to undermine us. As the others continued assessing damage and making calls, Sheriff Gaines pulled Frank aside. You know I can't prove Porter's involvement, he said quietly. Corporate espionage is notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially with his resources. I know, Frank acknowledged. We're not counting on legal justice. Gaines studied his old friend carefully. Just make sure whatever you're planning stays on the right side of the law. Frank, I'd hate to see you sink to his level. Frank clasped the sheriff's shoulder. Trust me, Tom, the best revenge isn't breaking the law. It's succeeding despite everything Porter throws at us. As Gaines departed, Frank found Julia at his side, her nurse's trained eye assessing his state. You should be furious, devastated, she observed. Yet you seem almost energized. Frank considered this. Porter thinks he's dealt us a killing blow. What he doesn't understand is that for people like us, people who faced real loss, this is just another problem to solve. Julia's expression softened. Rob used to say something similar. Setbacks just mean you're working on something worth fighting for. Smart man, your husband, Frank said, the familiar guilt now tempered by a sense of shared purpose with Rob's memory. Yes, he was, Julia agreed. And he would be so proud of what you and Emily have built here. She hesitated, then added, what we've all built together? Frank looked around at their damaged workshop, where the team was already beginning to clean up and plan next steps. Bedford was on the phone arranging for emergency security upgrades. Harris and Dr. Garrett were salvaging components that could be reused. David and Emily huddled over a laptop, already reconstructing digital models from their backups. Porter thinks he's fighting a small-town mechanic and a college student, Frank said. He doesn't realize he's up against a family. Julia's eyes widened slightly at his choice of words, then softened with understanding. Yes, she agreed quietly, a family. The demonstration had to be perfect. 3 weeks after the break-in, Frank stood backstage at the Midwest Adaptive Technology Conference, watching as potential investors, medical professionals, and industry representatives filled the auditorium. In the front row sat Richard Bedford, alongside representatives from 3 venture capital firms David had cultivated. More importantly, a dozen wheelchair and prosthetic users were positioned throughout the audience. Real people whose lives could be transformed by what they were about to present. "Nervous?" David asked, adjusting his father's tie, a concession Frank had made to the occasion despite his discomfort. "About the presentation, no." Frank had never feared public speaking. Explaining complex mechanical concepts came naturally to him. "About whether we've gotten the adaptive response system right in such a compressed timeline? Absolutely." Their rebuilt prototype, dubbed Second Step Adaptive, had been completed in a frantic 3-week development sprint. The entire team had worked around the clock, fueled by determination and a shared desire to prove Porter's tactics wouldn't defeat them. The result was actually superior to their stolen prototype, incorporating improvements they'd been considering but hadn't implemented. "It's ready," Emily assured him, wheeling up in her demonstration chair, modified with their most advanced systems. "We've run every test possible in the time we had. The response calibration is perfect." Frank nodded, trusting her assessment. Emily's standards were even higher than his own, particularly when it came to the adaptive technology that would allow their mobility devices to learn from each user's movement patterns. Dr. Garrett joined them, his bow tie even more precisely aligned than usual for the occasion. "Just received word that the VA Assistant Secretary is in attendance. Apparently, our security breach made enough waves to attract high-level attention." "Porter's here too," Harris reported grimly, nodding toward the back of the auditorium where the Meditech CEO had slipped in, attempting to remain inconspicuous. "Brought his technical team with him." Frank wasn't surprised. "Good. I want him to see this firsthand." The lights dimmed, signaling the presentation was about to begin. David checked his watch and nodded to the group. "Showtime." As David stepped onto the stage to introduce their company and vision, Frank turned to Emily, who would be demonstrating the wheelchair technology herself. "Ready for your big moment?" he asked. Emily nodded, a mixture of nervousness and determination in her eyes. "I've been ready for this my whole life." She hesitated, then added, "I wish Dad could see this." "He can," Frank said with unexpected certainty. "Through you." Emily blinked rapidly, fighting sudden emotion. Julia stepped forward, squeezing her daughter's shoulder. "Remember what we practiced," she said softly. "When you get to the stairs demonstration, pause for 3 seconds to let the system calibrate." Frank watched this mother-daughter moment with a sense of completion. Julia had become an integral part of their team, her medical knowledge and practical perspective grounding their more ambitious innovations in real-world usability. On stage, David was concluding his introduction, combining decades of mechanical expertise with cutting-edge adaptive technology and medical knowledge. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to present the Second Step Adaptive Mobility System, demonstrated by our lead engineer, Emily Blackwood." Emily took a deep breath, then wheeled confidently onto the stage as applause filled the auditorium. Frank, Harris, Julia, and Dr. Garrett moved to the side of the stage, ready to support the demonstration if needed. For the next 20 minutes, Emily showcased the revolutionary aspects of their system, the adaptive controls that learned user patterns, the stability enhancement that allowed navigation of uneven surfaces, the modular design that could be customized to individual needs. The audience watched in growing amazement as she demonstrated capabilities that far exceeded anything currently available on the market. The climax came when a set of stairs was rolled onto the stage, a traditional barrier for wheelchair users. Emily approached them, activated the Second Step's adaptive mode, and to audible gasps from the audience, smoothly ascended the steps. The chair's intelligent suspension and power distribution systems worked in harmony with Emily's movements, transforming a formerly impossible obstacle into a manageable path. Applause erupted as Emily reached the top and turned to face the audience, her expression radiant with the joy of breakthrough. Next came Harris's demonstration of their prosthetic innovations, showing how the same adaptive learning technology could be applied to artificial limbs, creating a more natural gait across varied terrain and reducing the physical toll on users. By the time David returned to the stage to discuss production plans and investment opportunities, the audience was thoroughly engaged. Frank could see investors leaning forward in their seats, medical professionals taking rapid notes, and most importantly, the wheelchair and prosthetic users in the audience watching with expressions of hope and excitement. As the presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, Frank caught sight of Porter exiting quickly, his face tight with barely controlled anger. The Meditech CEO had just witnessed his stolen prototype being thoroughly outperformed by technology developed in a fraction of the time. The remainder of the conference passed in a blur of investor meetings, media interviews, and conversations with potential users eager to be early adopters. By evening, David was juggling three serious investment offers. Dr. Garrett had secured expanded VA testing approval, and Emily had been approached by a national disability rights organization about becoming their technology ambassador. It was nearly midnight when the team finally gathered in their hotel suite, exhaustion and elation mingling in equal measure. $3 million in committed seed funding, David announced, loosening his tie with a relieved sigh, with another $5 million contingent on FDA clearance for the prosthetic line. The VA Assistant Secretary wants 20 units for an expanded clinical trial, Dr. Garrett added, his bow tie finally askew after the long day. Fast-tracked approval process, and 6 wheelchair users have already volunteered as beta testers, Emily reported, her eyes bright despite her exhaustion. Including 2 Paralympic athletes. Frank listened to these reports with quiet satisfaction. The technical challenges of the past weeks had consumed his attention so completely that he'd barely processed the larger implications of their work. Now, seeing the team's collective achievements, he allowed himself to acknowledge what they'd built together. Porter's not finished, Harris cautioned, ever the practical soldier. Today was a setback for him, but he still has resources and influence we can't match. Let him come, Frank replied with newfound confidence. We've got something he can't buy or steal, authentic purpose. Julia, who had been quietly observing the celebration, raised her glass of sparkling water. To authentic purpose, she toasted, and to new beginnings built from difficult endings. The simple toast carried emotional weight for all of them. Each had experienced loss and rebuilding in their own way. As they clinked glasses, Frank felt the presence of those not with them, his wife Sarah, Rob Blackwood, Harris's fallen comrades, the person David might have become had they not reconnected. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Frank said as the moment of reflection passed. Production capacity. With these orders coming in, we're going to outgrow our current facility faster than anticipated. I've been thinking about that, David replied. The old Wilson Metalworks property adjoining ours is available. We could expand our manufacturing there while keeping research and development in the Hendricks building. That still leaves us short on skilled assembly personnel, Dr. Garrett pointed out. These aren't components you can entrust to just anyone. Harris straightened slightly. I might have a solution for that. My old unit commander runs a veteran employment program, 35 vets with mechanical and technical training looking for meaningful work? Perfect, Frank nodded. People who understand exactly why precision and reliability matter in these devices. As the conversation turned to logistics and expansion plans, Frank found himself momentarily overwhelmed by how far they'd come. 6 months ago, he'd been a failing mechanic facing foreclosure, carrying 15 years of guilt and regret. Now he stood at the center of something transformative. Not just a business, but a mission that honored both Sarah's memory and Rob's sacrifice. Julia seemed to sense his thoughts, moving to stand beside him at the window overlooking the city lights. It's a lot to take in, she said quietly. Frank nodded. Sometimes I still expect to wake up in the old garage, fighting a losing battle against the bank. Instead, you're fighting a winning battle against Porter and the status quo, Julia observed with a small smile. Rob would have loved every minute of this. What about you? Frank asked, studying her face. This wasn't the life you planned either. Julia considered this, watching her daughter animatedly discussing design refinements with David and Harris. No, it wasn't. But plans change. Sometimes for the better. She met his gaze directly. I spent years angry at the world for taking Rob, for changing Emily's path. I didn't realize new paths could lead somewhere worthwhile too. The simple wisdom of her statement resonated deeply with Frank. New paths from broken ones. Second chances from what seemed like endings. We should get some rest, Julia suggested, noting the team's increasing fatigue. Tomorrow starts early. As the others dispersed to their rooms, Frank remained by the window a moment longer. Somewhere in the city below, Porter was likely plotting his next move. The road ahead would have its challenges, regulatory hurdles, manufacturing complexities, Porter's continued opposition. But for the first time in years, Frank felt ready for whatever came next. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had something better. A purpose worth the struggle and a family of choice to share it with. Second chances, it turned out, sometimes exceeded the original. 3 years later, the sign above the entrance read, Reynolds Blackwood Adaptive Technologies in modern lettering, with founded 2023 in smaller print beneath. The campus had expanded to encompass 3 buildings. The original Hendricks facility now served as their research and development center. The adjacent Wilson property housed their manufacturing operations, and a new building between them contained administrative offices and a state-of-the-art rehabilitation training center. Frank parked his truck in his reserved spot, a concession to his position as Chief Innovation Officer that he'd initially resisted but now accepted as necessary. At 68, his hands still bore the calluses of a working mechanic, but his role had evolved to focus on mentoring younger engineers and solving the most challenging design problems. The original Reynolds Auto still operated in the front section of the main building, serving the community's vehicle needs while also functioning as a real-world testing ground for mechanical innovations that might transfer to their medical devices. Frank spent at least 1 day a week there, keeping his hands dirty and his mechanical instincts sharp. As he walked toward the main entrance, he passed a delivery van emblazoned with their logo, one of a fleet that provided mobile repair services for second-step devices nationwide. The program had been Emily's idea, ensuring that users in rural areas had access to the same level of support as those near their service centers. Inside, the lobby displayed their journey, photographs of the original garage, the fire that had seemed like an ending, the renovated Hendricks building, and key milestones in their growth. Central to the display was a wall of letters and photographs from users whose lives had been transformed by their technology. "Morning, Mr. Reynolds," called the receptionist. "They're waiting for you in the conference room." The VA representatives arrived early. Frank nodded his thanks and headed toward the meeting that would finalize their largest contract yet, providing adaptive mobility devices to every VA hospital in the country. The 3-year battle with Porter and Meditech had finally ended in their favor. As Porter's unethical business practices caught up with him in the form of a federal investigation that had ultimately led to his resignation and Meditech's acquisition by a larger medical conglomerate. The conference room door was open, revealing a scene that still sometimes struck Frank as surreal. David stood at the head of the table, confidently walking the VA officials through financial projections. Dr. Garrett, now their chief medical officer, discussed clinical outcomes with the VA's medical director. Harris, who had risen to director of veteran services, was showcasing their latest training programs. Emily sat near the center of the activity. Her position as chief technology officer reflected in the respectful attention given to her technical explanations. Her wheelchair, now incorporating their 5th-generation adaptive technology, moved with such intuitive response to her commands that it seemed like an extension of her body rather than a separate device. Julia stood slightly apart, observing the proceedings with quiet pride. As their patient advocacy director, she ensured that every innovation served real needs rather than merely advancing technology for its own sake. Her practical wisdom had prevented countless well-intentioned missteps over the years. Frank paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, from financial disaster to industry leaders in 3 years, from a broken family to a found one, from guilt and regret to purpose and pride. "Frank," David called, spotting him. "Perfect timing. We were just getting to the expansion plans." As Frank joined the meeting, taking his place beside Emily, he caught Julia's eye across the table. Her smile held understanding of how far they'd all come, individually and together. The VA's chief administrator was speaking, "Particularly impressed by your commitment to affordability without compromising quality. Most companies in your position would be maximizing profit margins at this stage." "That was never our purpose," Frank replied simply. "We built this company because mobility is freedom, and freedom shouldn't be a luxury item." Emily nodded in agreement. Every design decision starts with a simple question: will this help someone move more freely through their world? As the meeting progressed to technical specifications and implementation timelines, Frank found his thoughts drifting to the journey that had brought them here. The snowy night that had reunited him with Rob's family. The fire that had destroyed his garage but sparked a new beginning. The bank foreclosure that had led to partnership rather than loss. Second chances, it turned out, often came disguised as endings. When the meeting concluded with handshakes and signed contracts, the team gathered in Frank's office to celebrate. Bedford was there, having remained a steadfast supporter and advisor. Several of their original veteran employees joined them, now department managers and shift supervisors. Emily raised her glass in a toast. "To second chances," she said, echoing Frank's thoughts, "and to the mechanics who know how to make them work." As glasses clinked and congratulations flowed, Frank felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for decades. He had kept his promise to Rob after all, not in the way he'd imagined, but perhaps in the way that mattered most. He had helped Rob's daughter find her path, and in doing so, had found his own. Outside his office window, the Reynolds Blackwood campus hummed with purposeful activity. In the testing area, a young veteran was taking her first steps with their latest prosthetic system, her face lighting with wonder at the natural movement. In the engineering lab, the next generation of adaptive technology was taking shape under the guidance of mentors who understood both mechanical principles and human needs. And in Frank's pocket, carried every day like a talisman, was an old bearing from Emily's wheelchair, the one he'd replaced on that snowy night years ago. A simple mechanical part that had set everything in motion. No job too small, no dream too big. The old Reynolds Auto motto had found new meaning in their shared journey. What had begun with a small repair on a snowy night had grown into something that transformed lives across the country. Not a bad second chance at all. They say you can't rebuild a life the way you rebuild an engine. Parts can't simply be replaced. Wounds don't heal with the turn of a wrench. Yet in the shadow of loss, something remarkable took form, not a perfect restoration, but something stronger at the broken places. A forgotten building, a wheelchair that needed fixing, a promise left unfulfilled for 15 years. These were the raw materials of redemption, assembled by hands still bearing the calluses of a lifetime spent fixing things that others deemed beyond repair. What began in that snowstorm transformed not just a failing garage, but the lives of everyone it touched. A father and son reconnected across the divide of misunderstanding. A widow found purpose beyond grief. A daughter discovered the legacy her father had truly left behind. And a man carrying the weight of survivor's guilt finally set down his burden, replacing it with something worth carrying forward. Some might call it fate that brought them together. Others would name it coincidence. But perhaps it was something simpler, the inevitable collision of broken people who refused to accept that broken meant finished. In the end, isn't that the most essential human skill? Not the ability to avoid failure, but the courage to build something meaningful from what remains.